Hey friends, it's Miss D'Angelo coming back to you with the next exit ticket, RL8.1 exit ticket. We're missing Jason actually and Andy, you guys both had low grades. I want you to redo these. Julio, Trevanda, Vershawn, you guys are missing this. Let's get started in going over this. Give me 1 second while I open it up. Make sure it's open on your end. Okay, so let's see the question. Ticket, how did Jim Crow impact violence against African Americans? Cite several pieces of textual evidence to support. Jim Crow impacted violence against African Americans by, well, let's talk about it. All right. We can go to Jim Crow laws. I must have done this lesson already because it's already saved in my navigation here. I'm glad it's sharing. So we're going to look up Jim Crow laws, and then I want you guys to be able to list them out. What I like to do is I always like to go into the one that has the highest reviews. And this one I've seen before, but I think it's really long. 17 minutes is too much. Oh yeah, this is the one I watched before. Okay, I think I've shown this to you before. If I haven't, I'm sorry. I'm going to share this screen with sound right now for you, and we're going to watch this. You're going to tell me why it was violent, and then what kind of law, like examples of these laws.
Today in the Daily Dose, Jim Crow laws in the segregated South. Named after a black minstrel show character, Jim Crow laws were a collection of mostly Southern state and local statutes that legalized racial segregation, which were implemented shortly after the end of the Civil War and lasted until the civil rights protests and federal legislation of the 1960s. The laws were intended to marginalize African Americans by suppressing their right to vote, limiting their access to good-paying jobs, while excluding access to higher education. Those who attempted to shirk the laws often faced arrest, fines, jail time, violence, and even death. In 1896, the first legal attempt to repeal Jim Crow laws was upheld in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the U.S. Supreme Court laid out its separate but equal doctrine, affirming racial segregation in public facilities, including the coaches of interstate trains and buses. Facilities for African Americans were routinely inferior and underfunded compared to facilities maintained exclusively for whites. While the laws as a whole institutionalized economic, educational, and social disadvantages for African Americans living in the South, segregation was also adhered to in the U.S. military, while in 1913, Southern Democratic President Woodrow Wilson initiated national segregation policies in federal workplaces. Southern statutes continued to impose poll taxes on Black Americans, attempting to suppress them from voting in local, state, and national elections. In 1954, segregation of state-funded public schools was declared unconstitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court under Chief Justice Earl Warren in the landmark case Brown versus Board of Education. Yet most Southern states dragged their feet for years before integration was finally achieved, against great backlash from white Southerners. In 1964, the Warren Court continued to rule against Jim Crow laws in other cases such as Heart of Atlanta Motel Inc. versus United States. The last vestiges of Jim Crow laws came to an end when they were overruled by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, followed by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, bringing to an end white America's long and stained history of racial suppression against Black Americans. And there you have it, Jim Crow laws in the segregated South, today in the Daily Dose. If you like learning
All right,
something new
so
every day,
it kind of went over the laws, but I really don't think that it went over enough. So I'm going to show you one more thing before you guys get into it. Oh, I don't know if I want to show you this, but here's a tour of the Jim Crow Museum. This might be a little bit disturbing, so we're gonna watch it with caution, but you guys are 8th grade. I think you can handle it.
Ask yourself the question, if you grow up and growing up you see literally thousands of examples in cartoons, in movies, in books, and in real life of blacks being the victims of pain, and the victims of aggression, and also the perpetuators, what seeds does that plant? What we try to do in the entire museum is to re-emphasize that the pieces in here are caricatures. They are not real people. It's a distortion. It's a lie.
I wish I was in the land of cotton, old times there, I'm not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland, in Dixieland where I was born in earth.
So I believe Miss Pringle showed you this web.
Many people who come to the Jim Crow Museum have little or no knowledge of Jim Crow. So we began the experience inside the museum with a display about Jim Crow, the character, and then we move into Jim Crow when it becomes depictions or portrayals of African American.
Sorry, I'm actually gonna go. I want to show you. So the question was, what's the violence, right? So I'm gonna skip around. So many places after dark or even during the day weren't safe for people who are Black. And it would have signs as you're going through these towns that basically said white only. And they would be like, you know, if you stopped there at night, you could get really hurt or killed by stopping in these sundown towns, they're called. So basically, after the sun went down, if you were a Black person found on the street or in this town, you could die. I'm gonna skip to another section here. The next place or next thing they're going to show you is lynching. So we're looking at violence specifically, right? So I'm just going to get there.
Shall be Malay, or Hindu shall be no.
It shall be unlawful.
Okay, so this is what I'm going to show you.
Jim Crow could not have existed without violence, real violence and the threat of violence. The reality is people would not put up with a caste system, being victimized within a caste system if they did not fear violence. And it is an unfortunate truth that in the United States history, that thousands of African Americans were brutally murdered. I think the message to learn here is that violence was instrumental. By that I mean it was an instrument used to control African Americans, to control their ambition, to say to them, no, you will not have a white man's job, you will not date a white man's woman, you will not attend a white man's school, and if you try to do those things or anything that implies that you believe that you are an equal to a white man, you risk your life.
I'm actually going to stop right here because I think these depictions are really disturbing. But I think you have to understand that they have a rise in the Ku Klux Klan who promotes violence. It's in order to keep the white people in power. It's in order to scare Black people. It's in order to make them follow laws that have just truly been, how do I explain? Created just to keep people down and keep white people up in the social class. And no one would follow these laws, they thought, if there wasn't violence. And it's very true. If there was no violence, you know, people would be like, why? Jim Crow laws, I'm not going to follow that. So they use violence to keep people in their quote unquote place. And just looking to see if there's anything else in this museum. No, but you should understand that these are depictions that happened, 100 years ago, even 50, 60 years ago. And it's not okay to use the words that are in here. It's not okay to treat people in this way. And if you watch the rest of this, you can, looking up Jim Crow laws and then looking at the new Jim Crow Museum at your own time, you're going to notice that some of these things are much more recent than you would have thought, right? Like this says any white guy 2012. That's in about election. So it's rather disturbing. This is a museum that I think is closed right now, but is giving virtual tours, and that is one of the reasons it is here. So let's go back and let's talk about what does Jim Crow and violence against African Americans look like? So I am going to have you start with the sentence that says this. In the years after the Civil War, there was a rise in the I hope I'm spelling this right. I don't know how to spell this. Klux Klan, the KKK. And Jim Crow laws. I want you to give some examples of Jim Crow laws. So some examples of Jim Crow laws are, and then you're going to just list a few of them that you saw. Separate what? Separate water fountains, buses, and other things. Name at least 3 to 4, please. And blank. Then I want you to say, why was the Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow laws so violent? So the Jim Crow laws were violent. And what kind of things did they do? They beat people in the streets. They think about hangings and trees. What is that called? What else did they say? Oh, sundown towns. I want you to talk about sundown towns and lynchings. I want you to describe what those are. And then finally, why was violence so important and with Jim Crow laws? So violence was needed to keep Jim Crow laws because. Why did they need that? All right, please fill this out and then turn it in. Thanks so much.